All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Real quick, we're talking about Entra ID, Office 365, Prism of GraphRunner, John Stoner, Google Cloud. Just a little bit of brief about myself. Spent time doing SecOps, detection engineering, threat intel, threat hunting. So built some adversary emulations around APT actors previous to this. Prior to coming to Google, I was with Splunk. We had built a blue team capture the flag called Boss of the SOC, and I had gotten interested in some of the Office 365 Entra ID stuff in the context of Golden SAML, which we had built an emulation off of. And I kind of continued to poke at that after I had left Splunk and started doing what I'm doing at Google. And where we landed with this was, you know, I felt like there was still some more to kind of uncover with this, and then this thing called GraphRunner got released, and I kind of kept pushing and prodding at it, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. I don't think I have any really spicy takes about this, but I do feel obliged since I work for Google and I'm talking about Microsoft stuff that applies. So just kind of take that in context. So as we're going to talk about this, I want to make sure that everybody kind of has a baseline understanding of a couple of these things. So we're going to talk about Entra and O365 logging to start, and then we're going to kind of look at this from an attack-defend perspective around GraphRunner, and breaking this into kind of a kill chain view of initial access discovery, lateral movement, collection, evasion. These also happen to be kind of aligned to some of the modules in GraphRunner, which you'll see as we go. So that's kind of the background and where we're going to go with this today. We'll start with the basics. We have Entra ID, formerly known as Azure Active Directory. I will try to say Entra ID. You'll probably see some Azure Active Directory. This whole renaming thing is kind of tough and difficult because we kind of get into those common things that we talk about, and so we're got to keep track of those things. But Entra ID itself, cloud-based identity access management used to manage external resources. Like what? Oh, how about O365? How about the Azure portal? How about any custom applications that you want to go ahead and set up inside of there and set up permissions to get to? Entra can do all of those things. The other actor in this is Office 365, which is a cloud service, right? We know this. We've lived with Microsoft Office for years, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and the like. But much more important to us, particularly from a defensive perspective and where the goodness is stored, is Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, which is where some of the focus is going to be. Then we have our other character in this, which is Microsoft Graph. And if you're not familiar with the Microsoft Graph, I've got some links in here that you can learn a little bit more about it. It's really, really cool in the sense that it's basically a backbone that connects all of these disparate things and exposes them via these APIs. It's really, really good from a development perspective. It's also very dangerous from a security perspective because if you kind of let people into those APIs, you kind of have a nice backbone to be able to get at all of these different information stores unless they're secured. So the basics of logging, we've got Entra ID audit logs, we have Entra ID sign-in logs, which are interactive sign-ins, and we have Office 365. If you are not logging any of these today but are using Office 365 and Entra ID, you don't have to leave the room now to go ahead and set it up, but set it up pretty soon if you're not already doing that, okay? These logs have been around for a while. They're fairly well understood. Most SIMs will go ahead and be able to collect these and do something with them. There's lots of good documentation out there. There is some overlap between them, which is kind of weird in the sense that you might sit there and go, well, if I have audit logs and sign-in logs, why do we need Office 365 logs? Well, there's some separation, some different things. Clearly, there are different groups that do the coding around these, and we'll kind of talk about some of those differences as we go. Then we have, on the other side of this, GraphRunner. So GraphRunner was built by folks over at Black Hills Information Security. It was released 2.5 years ago or so. But what it really, to me, was an eye-opener around this was because when I had done some of this stuff with Golden SAML, we're mired in the PowerShell ISE, and we're kind of building these API calls one by one, and it's tedious, and it's monotonous, and it's a pain to do, and you troubleshoot a lot. And what these guys did was they broke this into a set of functions, a set of modules, and they have permission flags and little kinds of true-false toggles in there, and it's published out on GitHub, and I can go ahead and read it and kind of go through it and go, oh, I'm not really good on PowerShell, but you know what, I can kind of see what they're trying to do here. So they really lowered the bar, rather than having to build my own PowerShell calls, to go ahead and utilize this to get to the Graph API. And they actually lowered it even a step farther to build a UI into it as well. Okay, the UI isn't all that, but it's a nice little thing. And so again, if I've lowered the bar for the adversary to get in there, I also have to be a little bit sharper from the defensive perspective to understand what's actually in here. So that's kind of where these two pieces came together and started looking at GraphRunner. Now, GraphRunner is broken into a number of different components: authentication, recon, persistence, pillage, and supplemental. Those are kind of the 5 module groupings. We're going to kind of touch on little parts of each one of these today. And the place we're going to start is authentication. So if I can't get into the graph, all of these things kind of stop dead, right? So obviously the first thing you want to do is keep people out of the graph. Unfortunately, to be able to actually do things in the graph, you need to let people in, right? So there's that challenge. There is a PowerShell function to help facilitate this access. There's other ways of getting into the graph itself. I was sitting in a talk a few months ago where a guy from the Microsoft Red team was talking about problems of tokens and being token reuse. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that. But clearly, there's lots of different ways to be able to get into this. But you have to authenticate to the graph. Another thing you can do is you can go ahead and create an OAuth flow into an Entra ID application. You can also refresh tokens periodically. So those are a couple of the modules that are there. So I just talked about tokens. I feel like I should probably define what I mean when I talk about tokens. There's 2 specific kinds of tokens we want to talk about: access tokens and refresh tokens. An access token is kind of like the ticket to ride, so to speak. You log in, you get your access, you have your permissions, you're good. You've got roughly 60 to 90 minutes. And when I say roughly 60 to 90 minutes, literally in the Microsoft documentation, it says you have 60 to 90 minutes. So 75 minutes on average, right, that I can go ahead and do whatever I'm going to do. And then after that, that's it. Now, every time I log in with an access token, I do get an interactive sign-in. So from a defensive perspective and a logging perspective, I see those access tokens. So a golden SAML style attack would be utilizing and forging an access token every time to be able to gain access. The refresh token is the other way to go ahead and work with OAuth and getting into the systems. And so OAuth refresh tokens by default have 24-hour refresh for single-page apps or SPAs, or 90 days for all other scenarios, okay? This is all totally normal OAuth kinds of things. Now, when I see things in documentation, I have a tendency to go ahead and put quotes around them, and then I tend to bold things that I find to be interesting that I want to call out. So I found this in this link, and I'm just going to kind of read it out here. Refresh tokens replace themselves with a fresh token upon every use. Makes sense. The identity platform does not revoke, that's my bold, old refresh tokens when used to fetch new access tokens. Okay, that's important to understand because that means I have old tokens that could be floating around there that could still be valid, right? So I got to make sure I kill all those tokens off because then the next sentence says securely delete the old tokens after acquiring a new one. Okay. Token refreshes need to be stored safely just like access tokens. Oh, okay, access tokens, application credentials, refresh tokens are in that same class, right? So I need to be mindful of that as well. Refresh tokens are kind of the challenge here that we're going to kind of start looking at, and you're going to see some of the pain points where those get inflicted if we don't take good care of them. So to gain initial access, I can issue a PowerShell command called get graph tokens, and there's 2 different options. There's the old user password auth, get a password user, password, I password spray, I can go ahead and authenticate, I'm in, right? Oh, MFA, everybody's got to have MFA on their cloud. Can you run cloud without MFA? The answer is yes, you still can. Microsoft has mandated it for Office 365 admin, Entra admin, and other kinds of more admin-centric kinds of things, but you don't necessarily have to have a multi-factor authentication to log into these environments. That may not seem important at the moment, but as you'll see as we kind of progress through this, all I need to do is get a single foothold at a lower level user, and then I'm kind of the guy inside the house who's making the phone call to be able to up my privilege from there. So we'll kind of talk about it as we go. When you do an OAuth login, you enter in some sort of a code like this. This is the external call where you'd handle multi-factor authentication, but we'll kind of get into that in a second. If I log in, I get Entra ID logging, or Entra ID sign-in logs for interactive sign-in. I get Office 365 sign-in logs. They have the username, the IP address they logged in from, an application that they're logging into, a user agent string, all that kind of stuff. What's interesting, just as a side note, is one's O365, one's Entra. Notice the user agent strings they're both Chrome Mobile iOS, okay? That's what they both are, but they're both very, very different, which again kind of goes back to probably having 2 different development teams coding the verbosity of the user agent string. Just kind of weird little differences that you see. If you're doing multi-factor authentication, you would go through this external call route. So I snatched the image over here from an ESPN Apple TV app because it's kind of the same process that you'd be using. Basically, when you do external call, You go to Entra and you say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and log in this way. And Entra says, yeah, cool. I'm going to go ahead and give you a token. And then I'm going to start ticking away at that for 15 minutes. And you got 15 minutes to come back to me with a good set of credentials to kind of let me complete this circuit. So you're sitting there going, okay, now I got to find a user. So the dotted line on the outside there is providing something to a user to entice them to go ahead and log in with their multi-factor authentication. So they go out to the little page or whatever that OAuth looks like. That OAuth login goes back to Entra and says, yeah, they're cool. Entra completes the circuit and says, okay, you're in. And you're sitting there going, how am I going to do this in 15 minutes? What's going to happen? Well, Netscope already wrote a blog on this. This was a little bit older. This is a fantastic example of a user experience for this external call. For those in the back who probably can't see this, on the far left-hand side, we have our phished O365 email. We're going to give you a terabyte of disk space to your OneDrive, right? Everybody wants an extra terabyte, don't they? So what you got to do is you got to go and log into this site. Well, that site is Microsoft.com/device-login. No problem. That's the OAuth login site. Here's the code that you need to use for the product code. That happens to be your 9-digit code, right, that the system was spinning up. And then, of course, enter your Outlook credentials. And then it goes on to say, don't share your login password. Use your MFA, right, all of the good security hygiene things. But when you're doing this, you're basically going along the steps I've got here. You enter your code for your 1 terabyte code. Then the next step is it says, hey, I noticed you're signing into Microsoft Office. Now, in mine, my adversary framework is in Canada. So the one extra clue that you'd have on mine is says that you're logging into Microsoft Office in Canada. So that's kind of odd if you're in the States, right? But otherwise, it would just say, hey, you're logging into Microsoft Office. What account do you want to use? Yep, I want my admin account here. Then it hits my two-factor authentication, which hits your phone, right? You got your authenticator on there. You put your authentication code in. It says, are you trying to sign into Microsoft Office? I want to make sure. And you say, yeah. And it says, fine, you're in. And when that happens, on the adversary side, you've got your authorization pending. Here's your JWT token, right? And over here in the global variables in GraphRunner, you have an access token, the scope, and the refresh token all written there for your using as long as you want to. And you're in, okay? So it's not a far-fetched way to be able to go ahead and gain access to that. A little bit of social engineering, need a timely request because it happens in 15 minutes. But once you're in, you're in. Now, there's another set of data that might be helpful to kind of help shed some light on this. These are called non-interactive sign-ins. Non-interactive sign-ins are set differently. They're going to you can only collect them, at least from what I've seen, through the Entra ID diagnostic settings. There's a toggle button, so you can click on the toggle to go ahead and select that. From my testing, you could go ahead and push it to a storage account, to an event hub. I've used Azure Functions to get at it from there. Insert it into your favorite SIM or log management, I won't judge. But it gets in there, various methods to get into that system, and then you're off and running. Non-interactive sign-ins are the place that token refreshes occur and are logged to. So if you're in the Azure portal, you could go into sign-ins, and you have a tab for interactive login, sign-in logs, there's managed identity and service principal, and they're across the top, and you can look at those. If you want to put it into your SIM, great, you can put it into your SIM, but it's important to understand that those non-interactive sign-ins are not found in O365 or Azure AD sign-in logs, and this impacts every third-party solution out there, right? So it doesn't matter if you're a Splunk or a QRadar or a Google or probably even a Sentinel. I'm not going to go into what Sentinel does or doesn't do, but I think basically you all would have to go ahead and handle it all in that same manner. When you see Azure AD and Entra sign-ins doing this, there's a couple of interesting things that happen. And so the logging on this is kind of funky because, again, you're going from kind of one form of logging to this token-based log that you're seeing. So kind of going from bottom to top here, what I have is I have my user, the user I'm targeting, right? And the IP address is showing the adversary infrastructure in Canada. So I get an initial block off of that, right, because multi-factor authentication pops up. So it blocks me. So normal user, in weird place, block, Firefox 135, which happens to be the login that the victim user was logging into the console to do their multi-factor authentication. Then you get the MFA was satisfied, which is the second factor. There's actually a duplicate row there of the two of them there. And then the final one on top is the non-interactive sign-in that happens about 2 seconds after the interactive sign-in happens. The user agent string flips from Firefox, which is what the user was using to log in locally when they were, getting fooled there, up to, in this case, it was an Android Galaxy Nexus, which was the user agent that I was spoofing there. So it's like there's something that happens in the background there that it's spoofing that over, and then it continues to be the IP address, so weird IP address, normal user agent string changes, but then I have that non-interactive sign-in, and it happens basically like that after that occurs, and then it's just there, and then it's just refreshed whenever you want to. Office 365 logs in a very different way in the sense that there's all those authorization pendings that are happening in the meantime. They're logging every single one of those. And what's wild is that you see the IP address of my victim infrastructure, and then those waitings are all the victim machine itself. But you still get that flip of the user agent string at the very end. You'll see things, if you're familiar with these logs in Office 365, you might see CMSI. And you might see KMSI. KMSI is keep me signed in. So if you ever have anybody pop up and says, you want to sign in less times, right? Yes or no. KMSI is yes, keep me signed in so I don't have to sign in as frequently. CMSI is check my sign in. Are you sure you wanted to log into Microsoft Office? Yes, keep me signed in, or check my sign in. So there's some interesting things that pop up in the logging stream as you go. The sessions change, the applications change. The session ID that's in Office 365 disappears when the non-interactive sign-in happens. If you're logging in with single-factor authentication, user password, there is no non-interactive sign-ins, it's just the access token, right? All of this is because you introduced the concept of a refresh token in there, but it also becomes important that if you have refresh tokens in your environment, non-interactive sign-ins provide some visibility that you don't have otherwise, and that's kind of the important takeaway there. So after my 75 minutes of access, right, my access token is then turning down. I may go ahead and run out of steam, but I could go ahead and run this invoke refresh graph token. And I supply the refresh token that's in my variable, right, that I've already captured, and I get another 75 minutes. And it's not logged into interactive sign-ins. It's only non-interactive sign-ins. So the only place you'd see it is a data set that you don't have to necessarily, or most people don't tend to often log, or are only starting to log. Okay, so it's kind of a potential gap there. Now, once I have my initial access, I'm in the graph, I've refreshed my token, right, because I've got these nice long token refreshes, I can start probing around and saying, tell me about the users, tell me about the conditional access policies, tell me about open inboxes, right, what are all those kinds of things that I have out there? And prior to about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, you couldn't see any of these things. And that was kind of super scary. And I saw this with the Golden SAML stuff when I was working on it as well. It was like, hey, tell me about all the users in the environment. No logs. Oh, okay. I want to change a user. Okay, well, we'll tell you about that. But if I ask for the list of users, I'm not going to give it to you. Graph activity logs has gone a long way to solving that. It doesn't solve everything, but it certainly solves a lot. So let's look at that. Same kind of thing to go ahead and ingest. Your last mile may vary, storage account, event hub, Azure function, however you want to get to it, but basically in the diagnostic settings, you select the graph activity logs and you can ingest that in and go do something with it. Once you have these look like, kind of more like HTTP web logs, if you will. So you get request URIs, which are huge. IP address of the user requesting it, user agent strings, user service principal, tenant application GUIDs, right? Which of the different systems are requesting it, and the scope of the requester, and then obviously the location associated with it. You also get the gets and the posts and the 400s and the 200s, and we'll touch on some of those in a second. So the first thing you might want to do is you might want to run this command called invoke GraphRecon. Invoke GraphRecon will go ahead and basically tell you about the tenant that you're on, that you have access to. Who's the contact, what kind of synchronization if they do ADFS or something like that, user settings, authorization policies, and the like. So it's a good kind of place to start and get a lay of the land. If you take nothing else away from this talk aside from making sure that you're doing your logging, the second thing I want you to take away is on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a whole bunch of things that it's basically telling you about the user settings of Azure. One of the things that you can do in Azure by default, or one of the things that Azure, or Entra ID, and do it again, did by default is it allows users to create their own apps. It also allows users to create their own groups. These might be perfectly fine things to do, but understand that the next steps that we're going to show you are things that are going to take advantage of those default settings. So there's probably some thoughts you want to put into your Entra environment to say, do I really want all my users to be able to create an application in the environment? And you'll see why here in a bit. When you're logging this, there is a session ID. The session ID will change when the refresh token changes. But in the meantime, if I'm looking at graph activity logs and I'm seeing all of the kinds of things I'm going to talk about here in a second, all associated with the same session ID, there's some good information there to say, wow, this individual is doing a bunch of these things under this same user account and is working through this thing and probably building out a profile of my tenant. So one of the things I might want to do is I might want to go ahead and dump the apps, right? What are the applications, okay? Because the applications themselves inside of Entra ID are kind of the gateway to that graph through the permissions. So you set an application, you poke holes in it with these permissions, and then you might have a certificate or you might have an app, a shared a secret key, what have you, but basically you're going to authenticate through that, get to the permissions, and be able to get to those other information stores. So the first thing I want to understand is, what are the applications inside of this tenant? When I do that, it's going to go ahead and hit the service principal endpoint, the application endpoint, the organization endpoint, and the user endpoint. So it's going to be super, super noisy because it's going through, and basically what's happening is it's going to go ahead and hit the service principal first and get a GUID. And then it's going to recursively go through the applications with those different GUIDs and looking for the app roles assigned to it, right? So there's a nice, hearty detection, hunt detection, whatever you want to call that, to be able to go ahead and bubble those kinds of things up because it's going through recursively, so it's going to be very, very chatty from that perspective to kind of understand more about what this individual is doing. But you can see the app that's coming back. This app's called New Year. It's got a nice GUID associated with it as a creation date. It has the delegated permission scopes of mail read write, user read, file read write all, contacts read write, calendar read write. And so it gives me kind of a starting point to go, oh, that's an interesting application that may give me access to things that I'm wanting to get to. Another thing I'm going to probably want to do is I'm going to go ahead and say, tell me about all the users in this tenant. Tell me about the security groups that those users are assigned to. Again, this is one's a little bit more high fidelity because of that recursiveness of going through those security groups and looking for the members inside of them. Just going ahead and getting a user pull, it hits the user endpoint once. It's not really a great detection signature. If I'm hunting and I'm looking for security groups and users in concert with one another, that's not so bad. Because of the recursive nature of the groups to the members, that's actually a pretty good one. But I can see that Jim Armstrong and Robert Yeager are part of the finance group, right? I can kind of see these kinds of things. And again, I'm building these profiles. Another powerful thing you can do is you could go ahead and say, tell me which inboxes are open. And when I say open, that means open to the token, open to the token that I have, right, in my hand. So which ones do I have out there? Well, it's going to go ahead and iterate through basically the user list that you provided. So I dumped the users in the previous step. Now I'm going to go ahead and read through that and say, tell me which inboxes are open. Okay? I've got a federated environment here that I built this test off of. So the graph activity logs are basically going to be of three types. There's going to be a 403, right? Forbidden. Hey, you can't read that inbox. There's going to be a 404. Can't find it. Okay, that's fine. I got these exchange boxes that are local that aren't federated up into the cloud. No problem. And I get 200s. Those are the ones that are hits that I can log into. Now, there's one log line in the middle there that is in purple that says email uncategorized, mail items accessed. That is the Office 365 log that you would see when somebody went ahead and ran this PowerShell function across all of this. Okay? You'd see O365 mail item accessed for that open one. You wouldn't see all the knocking on the doors and all the 403s and the 404s. And it's a non-specific address with a non-specific IP, which I'll get to in a little bit, and that's it. Instead, with the graph activity logs, I can actually see that it's hitting users, the specific username, the mail folders, the inbox, the messages. It's so much more granular looking at the graph activity logs. And so that's, again, another tool in your toolbox to be mindful of. Okay? It'll come back from the attacker side basically saying, hey, here's a success. You can read this inbox, and it'll actually give you an example of the last email message received, right? Now, of course, why would we have email boxes open to other people? People go on vacation. People make mistakes and misconfigure mailboxes, right? These things happen. But from an adversary perspective, if I can figure out which mailboxes I can go into, I can then start doing some of the other things down the road and start trolling around for more information to expand my footprint, and GraphRunner makes that pretty easy. So there's more reconnaissance stuff. I obviously don't have time to do all of them, but the Graph Activity API logs are super helpful. They also will go ahead, you also see throttling when you're running some of these activities. So I saw some 429 throttling. That might be also interesting to kind of go, wow, somebody's doing a lot of heavy hitting that the throttling's kicking in that maybe I should be looking at as well. By default, there is no spoofing of the user agent, so the user agent's going to be from the console that you run it in. So if you can see these up close, you'll see a lot of PowerShell 7.3 in the user agent string. It's because that was the PowerShell version that I had on there. And then the session ID is also a good thing to kind of loop things together. There's also an API in there. I haven't seen anything updated on this recently called Estimate Access API. This is an undocumented API. It's not the smoking gun, I'll tell you that right now, just ruin everybody's fun. Because like when I go into Azure and I'm doing my admin activities, I'll see Estimate APIs logging as well. But the idea with this is it submits an action. It basically says, well, does this user have the rights to be able to perform it? So it's kind of like a little thing that it's doing in the background. It's not, again, a smoking gun, but you know what? If I start seeing estimate access kinds of messages, maybe from my non-admins who are maybe not in the Azure portal, that might be something I want to look into a little bit farther and do a little more investigation around. All right, so I'm in. I kind of have my lay of the land here. Now I want to go ahead and persist. And there's 4 different modules for persistence. You can add a group member. Remember, we talked about defaults that were there for Azure. So add group member. I can clone a security group. That's pretty cool. I can invite a guest, or I can inject an OAuth app. And so in the time that we have, I chose to do the last one, which we'll talk about, which is create an application. But you can do these other things as well. If you inject an OAuth app, this basically allows you to create a new application inside of the Entra client that you have out there. And again, remember we talked about before, I don't necessarily have an admin's access right off the bat, but I'm the guy inside the house now, right? And I'm making the phone call, and so I can use this as a stepping stone to gain additional access. Now, this does require social engineering, but it's not time-bound like the last one was. Remember where it was like ding, 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 and I gotta get somebody to answer pretty quickly. This is something I can set up and just be running as a listener and just fish to my heart's content, and you'll see kind of what that looks like. You'll cache it in for an application token, so it's specifically the application that was created, and you'll get an access token, you'll get a refresh token, and off you go to keep building and building. So what does this look like? This is the high-level flow. The red are the adversary pieces. The blue or turquoise there is kind of the unsuspecting user and the outcome of that. I did this with a web server, so we used, I set up a Kali box to do this. You could do this in a number of different ways, however you want to do that. In fact, I've even seen and heard folks where they build it inside of, they've already gained local access to an environment and then put it inside the environment. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. But initially, you create the application with a set of permissions. GraphRunner, again, does a great job of like doing all of the heavy lifting for you, providing you the information back, even kind of templatizing the next steps, which you'll see. We redirect to the web server. The web server has some Python script running on it. I have a URL. That URL, I'm sending to that unsuspecting user because I am now trusted and inside, right? I could send that to them via a OneNote. I could send it in a OneDrive link. I could send it in a Teams message. I could send it in an email. But now I'm sending it as the user inside the organization, not the outsider saying, hey, click on this really wacky link, right? So I'm more trusted at that point. I then sit back and wait. At some point, they have to go ahead and click. We'll see what that looks like here in a second. But when they do, and they go ahead and accept the scope, the redirect happens. The auth code is sent to the web server. I collect it off the web server, and then I close the circuit with my GraphRunner to go ahead and have my application token, and I'm off and running. Okay? So let's see what this looks like. Again, very templatized. I go ahead and specify, what do I want this application to be called? What's the URL? I wasn't very slick with my URL. I used the same IP address as my infrastructure for my GraphRunner. I used 8080, but obviously, if you're doing this in real world, you can go ahead and spend the money on a nice domain and make it look good. You can go ahead and define your scope. Generally, your scope is not going to be something that's going to be like, security read-write events, right? It's going to be something a little bit more subtle from there. They have one called OP Backdoor, And OP backdoor picks a number of different lower level privileges, but pretty meaty kinds of things. You'll see what it looks like in a second and why OP backdoor is probably not the slickest way of going about it, but it's a really easy way to go ahead and define a set of scopes. It spins up your application. It then comes back and says, here's the application ID, here's the object ID, here's the secret. I went ahead and did all of that for you. You don't have to do any of those things. And then it comes back at the very bottom here, and this was kind of nice, that's step 7. Hey, once you get that OAuth code, basically paste your OAuth code in with this and run this command, and this will close that loop for you. So very, very easy to use. I prep my infrastructure over on Kali. I go ahead and run my Python script. I have to take the client ID that I just got, the secret that I just got, the scope that was just defined, right? I got to set up all those things on my Kali box. And then they give you the login for the Microsoft Online. Again, they're prompting you, really making it easy. That 4 lines of green is the stuff that you're going to have to get somebody to go ahead and click on. But again, I don't have to send them that. If I'm already inside, I can send that as a link, right? I can send it, I can make it a compelling event. I could go ahead and say, hey, the contractors are here and we need to get them access or we can't do whatever and they're sitting around and all that other kind of stuff. Now, here's why you don't necessarily want to use OP backdoor if you're trying to be slick on the adversary side, okay? When you first go ahead and set up an app, you get this listing of like, hey, here's all the things that you're going to go ahead and give access to. Do you want to do this? And again, I had to break it into 2 columns because otherwise the thing's like this, right? And we'd be into the ceiling and into the floor. Probably something to be a little suspicious about. But if I'm not trying to be too greedy, I could go ahead and focus on just Teams or just SharePoint or just Mail, right? And make it a little more chewable. And then again, I'm sending this to somebody. I want them to click on accept, but I've got time, right? And I have the advantage of potentially impersonating somebody internally who's basically asking for this. So I'm waiting. And when they do, the website redirect captures the OAuth code. I paste that into my template that they gave me generously over here. And I'm in. I now have an app token with an access token and a refresh token and the scope. And now I have an application. I've increased my foothold as somebody else within the environment. So what can you see from the defensive perspective when this happens? Well, all of that first step, spinning up the application, the service principal, the secret key, that's all goodness that's already being logged by O365 and Entra Audit. The Graph Activity Log will log it as well. There's a very verbose set of logs. You should be looking and understanding what applications are being created in your environment, what secret keys are being created, when they're being created, by whom, right? Frequency of those kinds of things. You should absolutely be monitoring for those already, but that's something that you can see pretty easily. The next part that we're waiting for is that unsuspecting user to go ahead and click and do for this injection. And again, no countdown clock, so we got to keep that in mind. The listener can stay up and you can fish all you want to, right? But when they do click on it, you get a consent to application. You get add app rights assignment grant to user. You have service principal added. You get delegated permission grants. There's a whole mess of things that are going to happen when that happens right away that you can be mindful of and keeping an eye out on. And then the last piece, which is that non-interactive sign-in, again, closing the loop. If you don't have non-interactive sign-in logs, you wouldn't necessarily see this last piece, but it's there. And it actually shows you the application name. This is the application of the app that we spun up, R&D Project Fish. In this case, the logging actually has that nice GUID in the application ID, so these are other examples of opportunities to go ahead and detect, because if you have a good handle on the applications that are in your environment, and you start seeing new applications coming in there from places and people you aren't expecting them to come from, you have somewhere to go with that. In fact, Graph Activity Log, once you're logged in and you're doing more stuff, let's say they're doing that user enumeration, they're doing more, they're doing more poking around in enumeration, that GUID maps to that application. So you can build your watch list to go ahead and look for these and cross-reference and say, hey, if it's not in this list, that's a problem. Why are people poking around in this? This is not an accepted application. So there's opportunities to kind of find and see these things to do something with. All right, so now I'm in. Now I potentially have worked my way up to maybe more of an administrative function or a higher level user, and I want to do some more gathering. That's not to say we couldn't have done gathering at the other user, but for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and jump into it here. Maybe I want to go ahead and go through somebody's email and say, what are the different emails that they have in their inbox? I can go ahead and use a command called getInbox. specify the name of the user, how many messages do you want? I don't want to be greedy, I'll take 500. And then output it to a file, and I can look at it offline. Now, this is where it starts getting interesting, and this is where graph activity logs kind of come into play to be really, really helpful. In my graph activity log, I get a get. I get a 200. Good to know. I get the URL, which says user, my username, mail folders, inbox, messages, top equals 500. That's good information. I get my user agent string. I get an IP address. That IP address is my adversary IP address, okay? A little bit more depressing is when you go to the O365 logs that are underneath that. I get mail item accessed, and I get an IP address of 20.190.139.173. I'm not going to ask you guys what that IP address is, but I can tell you it's a Microsoft address. It's an internal Microsoft address. So that's really not going to give me much of anything because mail items get accessed all the time. That URL that says top 500 messages, that's a little bit more helpful, okay? In fact, when you start looking at the logging that O365 has, it's kind of wacky. If you're accessing, so I've got 3 different settings here. You got UI web, UI client, API. When I say UI web, that means like you go through the Outlook portal, O365 portal, and you go to Outlook, and that's UI web. You have a hard client that you've loaded on your Windows box, a la Windows 95, right? That's UI client, and then we have API. I realize I'm dating myself as I said that. The UIs will both log the IP of the system, right? So if they're logging in from that, you get that. If you get a Microsoft address, that's the API, okay? That's just general kind of rule of thumb there to be mindful of. If you see the mail access type of sync, that indicates an Outlook client accessing it. And then if you see a client application ID is the application that you kind of punch through the hole to get to the mail. So another good thing to be mindful of is monitor which applications are accessing, choose your favorite thing, but in this case, mail, because that's going to show up in your log stream and say, why are people accessing through this API to get to my mail going through this application that I've never heard of or isn't an authorized place to do to access mail, right? I mean, again, some basic kinds of things. There's actually a CISA document at the bottom that I added to it. They published that in January that has some nice kind of reminders around working with O365 logs and mail. All right, I want to go ahead and search my SharePoint and my OneDrive for the user that I've got. Tell me about them. I could go ahead and specify my tokens, put a search term. I want to search for PDF. It'll come back and it'll say, okay, here's your cloud adoption framework. Here's where it is in SharePoint. Here's when it was created, last modified. Here's a file preview, and then here's the drive ID and item ID and that gorish long strings there. But you can go ahead and get that kind of information. When I want to go ahead and download it, do I want to download it or I just want to read it? This is kind of the tricky part. If I just want to go ahead and read it, the Graph API is going to hit the search and query endpoint, but not really give me any of those search terms. So you're a little bit blind on that. O365, if I choose to download it, will log the get 302, and it'll go ahead and give it a nice, shared documents, finance, budget addendum, that kind of a thing. But if I'm just looking in that UI that we had over here a second ago up at the top, I don't get any of that visibility. So there's kind of a logging gap there, or a visibility gap that you might encounter from that perspective. If I want to go ahead and search a mailbox, I could search for a term inside of a mailbox. Again, more logging associated with that. If it is successful, the query itself is a 200. If I start trying to go into the messages themselves and I get an error out like this, you could get a 400 message. So again, graph activity gives me a little bit more high fidelity logs as I'm poking around inside of that. Outlook 365 mail items access does not. In fact, the 400 failure that I showed there doesn't log in O365. The 200 will go ahead and trigger that mail item accessed, okay? So again, this is kind of where that logging and that interleaving of these different kinds of log sources helps provide that additional visibility, because if it's a success, you might see something in there. If it's a failure, you're not seeing any of the failures, only seeing the things that actually happened, right? So those attempts, you're not getting those attempts without the graph activity logs. Which brings us to the last section of this, which is the additional functions. This is a combination of defensive evasion, if you will, and then utilities. So file download that we talked about, that's a utility. Spinning up a basic web server to read that mail, that's in there as well. There's some other things like that. But you can also delete the apps, delete the groups, remove users from groups. So we did all of those things in those prior steps. Now I'm going to go ahead and silently pull those things down before I exit. And I can do that. Now, the good news is if somebody tries to delete an OAuth application, that is a logged function. It actually conducts a soft delete when you do it. To actually do a hard delete, I believe you have to be in the console and actually do a hard delete. So you would see the logging for deletions from Entra Audit and from O365, so that's good. Another thing for folks that are more on the adversary side of this, in terms of testing and everything else, it's very, very important that you keep good notes, because that client ID, that object ID, that secret that you're creating for those application tokens, you may need some of those later when you go ahead and close a PowerShell script, PowerShell console, and come back the next day and your tokens are gone, right? Same thing with refresh tokens and the like. So make sure you're taking good notes. This one's a good example of this, where you need to actually have the object ID that was created during the application section to actually delete the app itself. All right, which brings us to revoking refresh tokens. So I mentioned before that they suggest that you you revoke refresh tokens. You can't, and again, I'm quoting Microsoft here, you can't configure the lifetime of a refresh token. It is 24 hours for SPAs, 90 days for everything else. That's it. At one point, I believe they had some flexibility there. I assume it just got tough to manage and can keep track of, so it's 24 and 90. Now, you can use conditional access policies to force somebody to have to re-log in on a more regular basis. And so I'd highly recommend looking at something like that. In fact, they have a thing in preview now called token protection, which sits on top of the cap. And the idea with that is that I can't just take a token I picked up off the floor and apply it into my instance and be able to do things with it. But that's what that's designed to do. So if you have to revoke access, the way that you do this is using the MS Graph PowerShell. Now, this is important because up until March of 2025, you could still use Azure AD PowerShell, which was the legacy method. That is now done, dead, kaput. And if you have to if you have to revoke tokens on short notice, you probably want to be practiced at it, so you kind of know what you have to do. I can tell you the first couple times I was doing it, I was like, wait a second, now I got to, okay. All right, and I need PowerShell 7. I can't use PowerShell 5.1 for this, and those little kinds of things. So if you are in the business of having to revoke refresh tokens, practice, build your scripts, test them so you're ready to go. I've got some links there if you want to check it out, as well as some images there you can look at. When you do this, on the logging side, Entra, O365 do a pretty good job of logging this. I'm just going to call out a couple things here. They go ahead and they change the token valid from dates, so you can see those dates in the log stream. You can get update STS refresh token values. You get update user accounts. You get a disable account as well associated with that, and the Microsoft Graph also logs these things. So again, pretty robust logging when those things happen. On the adversary side, what do I see if I try to use a token that has been revoked? I see a 400, that's it, right? So if I'm in GraphRunner and I've got a token and I'm leveraging that, I get a 400 bad request, token's probably dead, but it doesn't tell me anything more. So it's a little bit on the vague side, right? It's probably not a bad thing from a defensive perspective. On the defensive perspective, if you're logging the non-interactive sign-ins, you'll get a block, and you'll get fresh auth token is needed, have the user re-sign in using fresh credentials. Again, much like the estimate access, just because you see a fresh auth token is needed does not mean that we have a smoking gun here that somebody has stolen tokens and has been refreshing them and you just revoked them, because you might be revoking them in a perfectly normal manner. But it's something to be aware of. And again, looking at the IP address, that's from the adversary infrastructure, coming from my Canadian locale there. So maybe if it's coming from an odd place, that might be something to go ahead and hone in on. Okay. So kind of to wrap this thing up, if you think about the attack flow with GraphRunner, we talked about these different modules: authentication, enumeration, pillage, persistence, defensive evasion. We've kind of walked through this where we started with that authentication, gained that initial foothold. We enumerated, right? We kind of skipped over the pillage for the first guy, but it was the same concept. We established the persistence with the OAuth app. We loop back in with that new user. We enumerate. We continue to pillage. right? Maybe we step up to another user. We could go ahead and loop back through. So you can kind of see where this loop back would continue to be happening throughout this. And then when my operation was done, I started going ahead and looking to cover my tracks. Okay, but it's one of these tools that because I have so much capability there, I can go ahead, gain more access, and then kind of loop back over and keep building and building and building. So, a couple things to leave you with. These data sources are very, very valuable. Non-interactive sign-ins and graph activity logs really, really help uncover a number of things that we wouldn't see otherwise. However, they can be a little chatty, okay? So there's tuning that has to go into this. For example, when you are logging Graph API activity logs, you probably have, you have a place that you are polling for that information. Every time you're polling for, hey, do I have new logs to go ahead and gather, that polling creates more logs, right? It's that kind of meta thing that's happening. So when you poll for more, you end up getting more. So there's some tuning that you have to do. I was able to tune my stuff out with the user agent pretty easy to go ahead and drop the stuff that was my polling administration. But you got to be mindful of those things. The other thing you have to be mindful of is there are legitimate API calls that MS services use that are going to generate those events as well. Now, again, they document what those are. So they say, hey, you know, if you're using Purview, this is the IP address over here, or you're looking at, you know, O365, here's the IP addresses over here. So you can go ahead and tune those things out, but you need to be mindful of that. So, because so much of this stuff is as design capabilities, right? We're logging in, we're just kind of doing some surreptitious things to get in. Once I'm in, a lot of these things are very, very normal kinds of things, right? This is, I wouldn't say it's quite living off the land, but you're doing kind of the admin kinds of things. You're doing some of them very odd, like saying, give me the top 500 messages of a user, but, right, a lot of this stuff is as designed, so there's a lot of leeway here. So, at this point, we're almost at the end of our talk. If you haven't set up Office 365, Entra ID sign-ins or Entra ID audit, I'd highly recommend doing that. I think we have a break at 5 or something, maybe between 5 and 5:30. If you just knock that out, that'd be great. If I'm prioritizing after that, Graph API activity logs I found to be very valuable. They covered a lot of that reconnaissance stuff that I just wouldn't see before. It gives you more fidelity around things like mail items accessed, so that was very, very helpful. The non-interactive sign-ins, I'd say, is probably the last of those 5, just because there's a lot to deal with there, but it does handle the refresh tokens and give you visibility there where you might not have it otherwise. Think about the refresh strategy for tokens. Think about the frequency of login. Those are some maybe easier places to also solve this. These are not necessarily logging capabilities. These are more policy kinds of things. Think about not letting all of the users go ahead and create their own applications, right? You kind of saw what we were able to do with that. Should users create their own groups? Same concept there as well. So be thinking about some of those things and say, maybe how can I go ahead and mitigate some of these pieces and maybe lower my visibility, lower my my attack surface overall. Again, Black Hills created GraphRunner. They did a fantastic job. It's out there on GitHub if you want to check it out. They've got an intro video and blog when they first announced it if you want to check it out and learn more about that. Invictus is based out of the Netherlands. They had done a couple of initial Defender's guides for GraphRunner, which I thought were decent. They were much more IR-centric focused. So they were like, hey, go into the Azure portal and start looking for these couple things. I tried to kind of take this from more of a tact of a threat hunting or a detection perspective. And then I've got some example rules that I built in YARA-L, which is what Google SecOps uses to kind of do some of these hunting detections as well. You can certainly check them out. Even if you don't use our tooling, you can certainly utilize it to get some ideas as to how to do some of the detections in addition to what we talked about here today. So with that, I think I've got a minute or two left. There's my contact information. I'm here today and tomorrow, happy to engage with anybody, talk about any of these kinds of things. Otherwise, I guess if we have a minute or two, we can take a question if anybody's got any questions.